Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name's Sylvia, and if you're a returning subscriber, then an extra special welcome to you. This is the absolutely tragic and brutal murder of Rosie Tapia. This is going to be kind of an upsetting case, so if you don't think this is the right video for you, feel free to click out because I do have other videos on my page that are less graphic. But without further ado, let's get into the case. 6-year-old Rosie Tapia lived with her parents and her younger brother and sister, who were twins, at 1616 Snow Queen Place in Salt Lake City, Utah. This was a fairly large apartment complex with a lot of families and a mainly Latino demographic. On a hot night in August, Rosie's parents wanted to go out, just the two of them, so Rosie and her younger brother and sister were going to be watched by their older sister Amelia, who was in her late teens at this time. She was also called Emo, which was her nickname, and for most of this video, I'm going to be referring to Rosie's family members as their relation to her. I feel like stories with a lot of names can get really confusing, but Amelia is an important name to remember since she was a really important witness in this case. When her parents got home at 3 a.m., her mother went and checked on the three sleeping children in the bedroom that they all shared. They were all sleeping soundly with the window open, and her mother went and closed it, but not all the way because she didn't want the sound to wake up the children because it was 3 a.m. A few hours later, at 5 a.m., on August 13th, 1995, Rosie's mother awoke abruptly. She had this weird feeling, and call it mother's intuition, but she knew that she needed to check on her children. To her mother's concern, their bedroom door was closed when she had left it open. Inside the bedroom, Rosie was gone, and the window was open and the screen was somehow removed. It would later be discovered that it had been pried off from the outside. A dresser that sat directly under the window happened to have a towel draped over it that night, and there was a boot print in the terry cloth of the towel. When the police arrived, they found that no valuables had been stolen from the home, and no one saw or heard anything that night within the household. A few sources say that the upstairs neighbor heard a scream around 4 a.m., but generally, you'll see that there were no witnesses to this abduction. In adulthood, Rosie's brother did come out and say that on that night, he woke up to a man standing over him who told him to go back to sleep. He described this man as having a beard and very hairy arms. And it's hard to know, and I'm not trying to discredit her brother, but he said that he didn't see anything at first, and then he only came out with this in adulthood. And I think it's really possible that he was interviewed so many times, and knowing that he was in the room when his sister was abducted, he wanted to remember something, and this is a false memory. But one note of credibility is that his bed was the one closest to the window, and the person would have walked past it to get to Rosie. For this abduction to happen so silently when Rosie was in the same room as her brother and sister and while the adults were home, police believed that Rosie must have been coerced into silence and complicitness. The very first thought police had when they got to this scene is that Rosie had gotten up herself and wandered off somehow. And a few days earlier, she had walked home by herself, unbeknownst to any of the adults. She had gotten confused and thought that she was supposed to go home from school, and she lived fairly close by, so she just walked herself home. So I think this is what gave the police the idea that maybe she just wanted to go on an adventure by herself. It kind of reminds me of the case of Asia Degree, which I also have covered extensively on YouTube and on TikTok. However, later that day, everyone would realize that this was a far more sinister case. Around midday, a man walking his dog along the canal that ran right next to the Tapia's apartment complex came across what he thought was a doll. In size, it resembled an American Girl doll, and it was floating fully clothed face down in the water. But he got closer and realized that a parent was about to get the worst news of their life. The body was identified as belonging to Rosie Tapia, and she was still wearing her pajamas from that night. However, the fact that she was still clothed doesn't mean that she didn't go through an absolutely horrific ordeal that night. So the autopsy found that Rosie had been brutally beaten and had signs of blunt force trauma. She had also been SA'd, including being fully penetrated by somebody's. Despite all of this, though, her cause of death was drowning. So she was found right where she'd been killed. The family had already been organizing searches, but now they were organizing a funeral. It was held at the local Catholic church and a vigil was held the day prior. Not only their apartment complex, which was full of children, but all of Salt Lake City was absolutely horrified to find that a young, innocent life had been taken so violently. At her funeral, Rosie was remembered as a joyful child who liked to sing, dance, and draw. She also really liked dressing up in her older sister's clothes, and she really liked playing at the apartment complex playground. Canine units searched around the apartment complex to see if they could find the spot where Rosie went into the water. Police believe that the kidnapper immediately took Rosie to that canal where they essayed her, and she then went into the water some meters away from where she was initially found. And given that at 3 a.m. she was safe and sound in her room, and 5 a.m. is when she was discovered missing, all of this happened very, very quickly. Because she was floating in the canal water, most of the DNA evidence on her body was contaminated. Canals collect runoff from several different areas, so they're full of bacteria and germs. And it's unfortunate because an essay usually leaves DNA, and Rosie had fought to stop what was happening to her that night, and they also found DNA underneath her fingernails. But all of this was contaminated by the canal water, so police haven't really been able to use this DNA. And of course, police questioned the family on any strange events that might have involved Rosie leading up to her abduction. Most children who are abducted know their kidnapper in some way, even if it's just in passing. And Rosie's sister did recall that something strange had happened earlier that day involving Rosie. Around dinner time the evening before Rosie vanished, Amelia had left Rosie to play at the playground in the center of their apartment complex while she went and checked on the twins. Amelia left Rosie alone to go to the apartment, and around 15 minutes later, Amelia heard a knock at the door. She opened the door to find a man in a hat and sunglasses standing there holding Rosie in his arms. He told her that Rosie had gotten hurt while going down the slide. Basically, like she had gone down the slide and was sitting at the base of it, and another kid didn't wait for her to get up, so they went down and she got like kicked in the back. Rosie was hurt and upset, so the man carried her home. And at first, he just seemed like a good Samaritan. And that's what you'll see him referred to in this case. He's called the Good Samaritan. Amelia found this odd and took Rosie from this man, and she thanked him and went to close the door. But as she was closing the door, she heard the man go, "Bye, Rosie." She then found out that Rosie never told this man her name, and he wasn't known to the family. So somehow he had caught Rosie's name. In her interview with On the Case with Paula Zahn, Amelia said she then checked Rosie for injuries and didn't see any scratches or bruises. So she asked Rosie what happened at the playground. Did you get hurt? And Rosie said, "No, I didn't get hurt." And Amelia asked, "Then why did that man say you got hurt?" And Rosie said she didn't know. Another creepy thing is that Rosie said that this man didn't appear to have children of his own playing at the apartment complex. He was just like sitting there watching all the kids play. Amelia thought that this was weird, but given the fact that Rosie was abducted just hours later, made this interaction extremely suspicious. This man was the number one person that police wanted to talk to. And Amelia didn't get this man's name, but she described him as being white with a thin build and no beard. And she said he was wearing a baseball cap and sunglasses, which again, I find incredibly suspicious. That's like a disguise. That's what celebrities wear when they want to go out and not get recognized. And also, if I was escorting a child back to their parents, me personally, I would like stop and like take off my sunglasses. I would like make myself look presentable because I mean, you're carrying someone else's kid. Like, that's pretty off putting to most parents. And I think it's also very strange that he was holding Rosie. It's not like she was standing next to him and he was holding her hand, but he was physically holding Rosie in his arms, which is very intimate to do to a child that you don't know. And it's almost like this man wanted to test Rosie's temperament to see how she would react to being picked up and carried to another location. And another thing is that no one knows how this man would know which apartment number was Rosie's. It seemed like he could have been watching her for a while, and that's how he would know where she lived and what her name was. Because this was a pretty big apartment complex. It's not like it was a 1 in 4 chance that he would pick the right apartment that she lived in. Like, this was a big building. Police interviewed people at the apartment complex, and many residents said that a man would sit out at the playground and play guitar for all of the children. Immediately following the discovery of Rosie's body in 1995, police sought out this man thinking that he could be this good Samaritan that brought Rosie back that night. People were pointing the finger at this man who would play guitar, and police followed up with him thinking that he was the good Samaritan. However, investigators learned that the guy who played guitar did have a son that would play at the playground, so he was just like in the crowd of children the whole time, and people didn't realize that he actually did have a kid there. And to further corroborate the belief that these are two different men, the police found that the guy who played guitar was actually out of town that night, and he got home too late to be the Good Samaritan who brought Rosie home. Police also said that they located the Good Samaritan, found that he did have a child that played at the apartment complex, and said that he didn't seem to have anything to do with the case. However, it later came out that the police did not get the Good Samaritan's name and they didn't write down any of this information. So to me, this finding basically means nothing. Like, the police clearly weren't paying attention. I don't know what they were thinking when they were interviewing someone who potentially had contact with Rosie the day before she was abducted. I don't know what they were thinking. They're probably thinking about a donut. They definitely dropped the ball, and that could be why Rosie's case is still unsolved today. It also came out that there was at least one other child who was molested at that same apartment complex. And when they reported this to the apartment staff, they were told to keep quiet about it. There was also an attempted child abduction a year earlier. So this apartment complex sounds really sketchy. There's not much information about either incident. We don't know if they were reported to the police or if there's any like description of the attacker or the attempted like kidnapper. But we do know that these were two young girls around Rosie's age. Residents of the apartment complex were understandably extremely frightened. And luckily, the owner of the apartment complex did take this seriously. He even used some of his own money to put into the pool for information leading to Rosie's case. And he also hired a security guard to work nightly at the apartment complex to help keep everybody safe. I think that answers in Rosie's case lie in this apartment complex. I think that whoever did this either lived in the apartment complex or at least close by. First of all, that child was molested on site at the apartments, and this person knew that Rosie slept in that bedroom. It's also really curious that this abduction occurred on a night where her parents went out. I mean, they were home at the time of her abduction, but the fact that they had gone out that night, maybe the killer deemed this as the perfect opportunity to strike. And again, that matches up with the Good Samaritan because he knew where Rosie lived. Police do believe that whoever did this had been watching Rosie for quite a while. They needed to find out where she lived and the quietest way to get her from point A to point B. Another interesting detail is that this was a fairly new bedroom for Rosie. Just 2 months earlier, it had been the bedroom of Amelia. Only recently did Amelia move out and the three children started to occupy that room. And another important detail in this case is that someone called in a tip saying they saw someone walking along the canal early that morning. At first glance, this man was wearing two-tone jeans, but the witness then realized that his jeans were darker from the knee down because they were wet, almost like he'd been wading in the canal. The witness was only able to see this person of interest walking because a white truck driving by had done a U-turn and the headlights illuminated this person. We don't know who this white truck belonged to or if they had anything to do with the crime. So this witness described the person of interest walking as a teenager with a thin build. He said that he seemed like he was in his late teens and was kind of lanky, and also identified him as being Hispanic. It's widely believed that the person seen walking along the canal is different from the Good Samaritan. First of all, Amelia saw the Good Samaritan and had a conversation with him, and said that he was white. But if you look at the suspect sketch of the Good Samaritan and of the teenager walking along the canal, they do look pretty similar. This information was given to detectives in the initial days of the investigation, but the witness said that no one was interested in hearing it. This information wasn't given to the public until several years later, which is so frustrating because people's memory fades with time. You could ask somebody, oh, on the night of 1995, did you have like a son or a brother that was unaccounted for that night, or who maybe came home with wet jeans? But as time goes on, people are going to be less likely to remember that. Like I said, Amelia used to stay in Rosie's bedroom. And while she was living in the house, again, she was like a teenager, she had a boyfriend that would sneak in through that exact same window that was broken into. And this ex boyfriend would often be driven to these late night meetups at the Tapia's home by a friend. After Rosie's abduction, when the police said that they would be releasing a suspect sketch of the creepy Good Samaritan, the friend said to the ex boyfriend, "Wouldn't it be funny if it looked like one of us?" And the ex boyfriend found this to be pretty weird. Again, though, the Good Samaritan did speak with Amelia, but we don't know if Amelia knew this friend. If he was friends with her boyfriend, then you'd think that they would have met, or like maybe she would have seen him dropping him off, but we don't really know. This unnamed friend did have an alibi for that night. He was with, I don't know if it was currently his wife or if they ended up getting married later, but the alibi is known as his wife, who says that they were together that night. Since then, they've divorced and she's stuck to this story, but I have noticed in true crime, sometimes there's a loved one that vouches for the person and gives them an alibi, which basically like makes the police stop investigating that person entirely, and it's later comes out that they were manipulated into doing this, or there was some element of fear. So that could be this situation, but maybe she just like doesn't want to get involved. We don't know. Maybe she's telling the truth. Also, this friend did have a clean police record before and after Rosie's abduction, so I think that's important to point out. Rosie's family also discovered something pretty suspicious at her gravesite. A few days after she was buried, a single Barbie was found placed at her grave, and they think that whoever placed this Barbie there may have been the killer, feeling remorse for what they did to Rosie. This Barbie had been run through. She was pretty dirty and she has like chew marks on her feet. And to this day, the Tapia family still has that Barbie in a Ziploc bag, in case someone ever does confess or maybe there's like a connection made. The family does have that doll to potentially collect DNA from. Rosie's family has expressed their frustration in the police handling of her case. I feel like a lot more could have been done in the initial days of the investigation to interview residents of the apartment complex, to potentially identify the Good Samaritan. And as always, I think it's really important to get information about these crimes out to the public so that people can call in tips that could potentially be used to solve the murder. Amelia passed away in 2020 due to an illness, so all of the information that she's given is finite and there's no chance to interview her. But before she passed, she did do a photo lineup with police. So they collected a series of photos in hopes that she could identify the Good Samaritan. And the man that she picked out was someone who residents said frequented the apartment complex. An eerie detail is that people who lived at the apartment said that this man disappeared after Rosie's murder and never came back. So again, that's really, really creepy. Advances in DNA technology give hope that the DNA that was found on Rosie's body could potentially be linked back to someone. Over 60 people have been swabbed for DNA in this case, but nobody has been matched. And this case has been unsolved for 28 years. Rosie's murder bears a lot of similarities to another murder that occurred in West Jordan, Utah. This little girl was around Rosie's age and she was abducted from her bedroom, essayed, and then drowned in a canal. Her name was Sierra Newbold and her killer was identified and given a life sentence. This happened in 2012 and the murderer was her neighbor. Because of the similarities to Rosie's case, the killer, whose name is Terry Lee Black, has been pursued as a potential suspect. However, he has refused to cooperate with authorities and hasn't given them any information. Police haven't been able to build any solid connections, but I do think that he looks like the suspect sketch. He has that same really gaunt face, and I think it's really likely that whoever did this was Hispanic since there were so many like Hispanic people living in the apartment complex. The boy walking along the canal, the witness said he looked Hispanic, but then Amelia said that the Good Samaritan was white. Maybe he was like white passing, but I don't know. I mean, Terry Lee Black looks like the sketch. He could be the person walking along the canal. He could be the Good Samaritan. All of these people could be the same person. Even though he's now in his late 40s, he was in his early 20s at the time of Rosie's murder, and late teens, early 20s. There's a lot of crossover there. Maybe he seemed younger than he was. But a major roadblock in connecting Terry Lee Black to Rosie's murder is the fact that there's no evidence that he was living in Utah in 1995. However, though, the murder of Sierra Newbold did occur in Utah in 2012, so he does have connections to that state. So that's all the information I have for you guys in the unsolved murder of Rosie Tapia. As always, I'm putting a resource in the description in case you have any information that could lead to identifying her killer. Maybe you lived in the apartment complex, or you lived in Salt Lake City, or someone told you something really sketchy. Either way, if you have any firsthand information, I really think that it's important to call the tip line because her family has been searching for answers for 28 years. And unfortunately, Amelia has passed, but I do think it's really important to give her remaining family members answers. Engagement always helps, so if you liked this video, then please give me a thumbs up to let me know and to let YouTube know. And if you like true crime, then subscribe to my channel. Until next video, I hope you guys all have a wonderful day and stay safe.